she's a very loving dog, but the level of intelligence between the two dogs is wildly different. Like she's right now trying to push her head through a closed dog door. You figure after the first time of it not opening, you'd stop. But she's like, hey, I'm going to try 27 more times.
Yeah. And that one time it works, it'll be everything to her. Welcome to this episode of Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets. My name is Stefan van Duyvendijk. I'm the accounting operational evangelist for FloQast. I'm your guest host today in place of Mike Whitmire, the co-founder and CEO of FloQast. But I'm really excited to be here today to be the host. I'm very excited for our guests and what we're going to talk about. Our kind of topic today is the rise of the operational controller. And we're really lucky to get a unique perspective of someone that we think represents a strong operational controller in the industry, Dante Giannini, who is the corporate controller with Actian. So with that, Dante, I'd love to just get a little bit of your background for the audience. And feel free to go into detail here.
Perfect. Hey, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be a part of this. So thank you. So my background, probably not too dissimilar actually from a lot of people at your company, from what I understand. Started in audit. I was with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Back when SOX had just come out, the stock option restatement had just hit the industry. So it was really, really intense hours. I was with them until just about to become senior. Realized that I'd be doing the same stuff there that I had been doing the past couple of years. So one Saturday night, I'm sitting in front of my computer going through some stock option reports, and I got an email from a recruiter and decided to step out to industry. I started as a SOX auditor with Calidus Cloud, which gave me really interesting early experience in my career, or reporting to the audit committee with a dotted line. So I eventually grew from that position through general accounting manager, and then I moved over to services revenue manager. After a couple of years with Calidus, I started looking for other opportunities to continue to expand my career. Most of them were within revenue, and so I ended up owning at one point all of basically orders to cash, and so that was really, really interesting. Was with Symantec in their technical revenue department for a couple of years. Realized that I had gone so far down the revenue path that I really needed to make a shift back to general accounting to achieve kind of my own personal goals of becoming corporate controller later in my career. Happened to be very lucky to join ServiceNow. I was one of their first general accounting hires in the Bay Area. I joined ServiceNow when they were about $350 million in revenue. I scaled with them to about $1.2 billion.
Oof, that's a large scaling.
It was a lot of work. It was a lot of weekend work, but a lot of the time it was fun. Yeah, and so I stayed there for as long as it was fun. And when it stopped being fun, I started looking for other opportunities.
Right.
And I was very lucky to become the corporate controller for Periscope Data. They were based out of San Francisco, Series B startup. Did everything for them. In fact, I even owned legal while I was there. And I owned facilities as well outside of my core accounting functions. And so my first roles as a corporate controller, I was stepping outside of kind of my comfort zone of accounting. Yeah. Periscope was eventually acquired by Science Data. And at that point in time, I decided that it was probably good to look for something a little closer to home. I live in Fremont. I was commuting about an hour to an hour and a half away for work up to San Francisco, which the Bay Area is small geographically, but there's so many cars that it takes forever to go anywhere.
Yeah. Been there, experienced that. Just, you'll be driving outside of the city and it's like, no problem. And then you try to go like 3 blocks in the city. You're like, I give up. Like, I'm just going to pull over here and walk.
Yep. Yeah. So I was fortunate enough to meet Mark Monahan, who's the CFO for Actian. He and I got to chatting, and he brought me on as the corporate controller for Actian. I've been with Actian just over 3 years. And in the past couple of months, I've now taken on sales operations and commissions, which has both had some really interesting operational aspects to it. Some of the ways that you'll see commissions broken up, where there's an operational side of commissions, for example, and then there's the accounting side of commissions. Here, all of that's housed in one department. And so right. I get the operational side of commissions. I'm getting all the operational side of sales operations, which has been really great and interesting because now I get to interact with more people in a different way than I normally would have. Being in accounting, being at the corporate controller level, I've always interacted with the CRO and those folks. But it was in a, how do I help you structure your deal so that you don't trip over any red tape? Now it's very different. It's very operational. It's very understanding what is motivating the sales team. How are these deals coming to be? How are we structuring these deals? And then operationally, how do we move things through the system in a consistent manner that people can rely on? And when they look back, they said, I did it this way here. I understand why we're doing it that way there. Yeah. And people don't go back and say, oh, well, we did this deal this way, but now you're telling me it's something different, or I've got to do something different. It's really thinking about just how do I make these processes repeatable for things that can be unique.
Yep. Well, and yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of good stuff. I mean, I think I could dive into your background for a full hour, but I'm going to take it a big step back actually, and just go back to that transition when you left public accounting and you went to this internal audit path. And we don't really need to talk about that, but that internal audit path where you're looking at a lot of the company's processes, you're working on really process improvement, process adherence, which is so key in a lot of what you're talking about today, and then transitioning into a general accounting manager. Did you feel like that experience as internal audit was really helpful in that process, or was there a big leap there? Did you then have to develop a whole bunch of skills?
So what was really interesting for me about that opportunity is how much I didn't appreciate the impact it was going to have on my career later on. Mm-hmm. At the time, I was very focused. I joined as an associate level internal auditor and realized that I could make some real big contributions. And so I wanted to really start running that engagement as a whole. We had it outsourced for a part, and I thought, I can really do this all together. And what it taught me was a few things. One, that the way that people were looking at SOX wasn't a way, they weren't looking at it as an augmentation of their controls. It was looking at justifying how they were doing things already. Mm-hmm. In that thought process, the concept was, SOX happened, controls blew up, there's controls around everything. And then it was, how do I make meaningful controls? How do I have meaningful checkpoints and touch points? And that thought process, I didn't appreciate early on in my career, but as I've been involved in more operational things later on in my career, I realized how kind of transformational that was for me. Being able to step back and eliminate things that didn't make sense and make sure that the controls were in the right place without having to horribly destroy our processes was fantastic. And then the opportunity to sit in front of the board and present, to the audit committee, how we're doing on our controls, which controls we eliminated, why, how we're still addressing the risk associated with that. All these things I didn't really appreciate until I was a little bit later on in my career and realized how important that stuff was for me to not just think about the fundamental accounting, but then to think, how are these processes working? How are all the pieces from outside of accounting flowing into accounting? Are those other pieces including the right information so that I'm comfortable with my numbers? And I always come from this as a place, all the right stuff, right? Making sure we're addressing the right risk, making sure we have the right controls. But at the end of the day, I really, really want to make life better for my team. I don't want people to go home after a 16-hour day and say, geez, there's a lot of manual work there. My thought is, how do we have the right processes, controls, and technologies in place so that everybody goes home on an 8-hour day? I mean, we're in accounting. We get crunched on quarter ends. That's part of the job, but we don't need to get crunched all the time. So,
Well, and I love that kind of transformational thought process, right? Where, and I would agree, that's kind of how I used to look at controls is even from an audit perspective, when I was at KPMG, when you first start as an associate, you just you work towards making the company's controls fit the risk, not looking at the risk and making sure that controls are addressing it right. Now, the managers and partners are looking at it appropriately, but when you're new, you're just trying to fit a square peg into a round hole in the hopes that it satisfies the need, even though it's not really functioning correctly. And so, and that's where all your comments come from your boss for you did this wrong, but you don't have that thought process. And then you move along, you realize, okay, Then you kind of take that shift into a risk-based approach and you say, okay, well, what are my risks? Am I addressing this appropriately and not worried about what we are doing, but what we should be doing? And then if you take it a step further, like you're saying, and from that risk and say, listen, I know I need to address the risk, but like, I need to manage risk. I don't need to perfectly, eliminate risk. There's a huge difference in that thought process. And if managing risk to me is kind of what you're saying, where I'm addressing the risk, but I'm also addressing what it means for my company, right? And there needs to be a balance. And I need to have an acceptable level of risk there with an acceptable level of work from my team. So I think that's huge. And really, I couldn't agree more with it's kind of a slow progression there, but that it's such an important thing to realize. And it's such an important philosophy to eventually develop in your career. It sounds like you then went into the revenue side of the house, which is awesome. Sounds like it was probably painful because this was pre-606. And so you got to go through all the 606 adoption, which must have been wonderful. Were there big learning experiences there, or did you see other shifts in the accounting function and controllership, kind of like you're talking with, managing risk instead of, necessarily trying to eliminate it?
Yeah. So, what's been interesting. So if I step back and just unpack a couple of things, what I thought was interesting about 606 was that it did not affect SaaS companies. So FloQast being a SaaS company, 606 had very little impact on you guys. Maybe there's some impact on how you look at your commissions a little bit differently.
Yeah,
now.
Your bundling of the contracts, right?
Your bundling of the contracts, your amortization of the commissions over what period, and how does that make sense and whatnot. But that was maybe the biggest impact to you guys. Where it was really, I think, transformational was for companies like Actian, whose go-to-market strategy was more around what they used to call subscription, but were really term-based licenses. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting to me that the accounting lords, if you will, decided that term-based licenses should really be looked at like perpetual licenses were back in the day, and that was a huge shift for a lot of these companies. And that was the piece that I think was really painful for the whole thing. I understand the argument. So there's that. But in that kind of shift and transition to things, again, it made you go back and look at the way that you're operating, because you can't operate the same way in 606 as you could in 605. And so the way that your contracts are structured, the language you have in that, what gets captured in Salesforce, and how those things then hook into, your NetSuites or your Oracles or your SAPs, all of those processes need to be addressed with this kind of fundamental shift in the accounting guidance. And then with that, how other, technologies sit on top of that. Exactly. For example, how you look at commissions, the way you calculate and pay somebody is now different than the entries that you're going to book in your system. And so how does exactly help support that stuff? And what can you do to leverage that technology? And so then you go back again, where you're sitting, whether it's in revenue or a general accounting manager, assistant controller, you didn't have to go back and look at these processes and say, how are these processes affecting my financials? And are they working the way that we need them to? And I think this conversation has happened multiple times. Anytime there's been a big accounting change, people sit back and say, how do our processes support the accuracy of our financials in the way that we need to, without crushing the team and doing it in some super manual way?
Right.
And to that point, and kind of, I think to the point that we had talked about offline, I think that's why you're starting to see more of these operational things starting to fit under the controller, because the controller now sits back and says, hey, this information from Salesforce is flowing into NetSuite, and I need it to flow in a certain way. But I don't have influence the way that I would need to in order to make those changes. And so I think some of the change now is, well, let's have the controllers have the influence they need over those departments. And then when you take those on, then you're taking on more of this operational stuff. And then you have to start looking at things entirely differently, right? How do I support my sales leaders, get them the information they need, be flexible enough for them to drive business without handcuffing them for arbitrary, what they would view as arbitrary rules,
Yep.
But then make sure that we're capturing the data correctly, and that as that data flows through our processes, it's hitting our financials accurately. And how do I do that in a meaningful way that is quick, accurate, but doesn't crush everyone?
Yeah. Well, and I was literally, you kind of took the words out of my mouth, because I was going to ask you the question of, do you think 606 and really the software industry in general has pushed a lot of the shift we've seen from, controllership being very reporting based and more tactical for the organization, or very just maybe meeting not really considered value add contributions to the organization, to having to be broader in the organization, being part of the whole order to cash process, working with operations. And to me, it seems like there has been like software growing in the industry, not just accounting, but just software coming about, and these subscription services has been a catalyst of change for the broader business economy, to where it's like, accounting has a place here to help you with all these things. And you really just touched on that. You're like, yeah, that's kind of what you're seeing within the organization is you had these specific rules that people have to meet, but the only group that understands that is the office of the CFO and the controllership, right? So your operational leaders do not have the background in any kind of way to really address these regulatory items. So you have to, like, by nature, the controller or whoever is a part of like your revenue recognition or your technical accounting has to come in and help. And I think the success we've had within our organization with running month-end closes, this iterative process, meeting that deadline every time, when we're seen in the broader organization, all of a sudden they're like, oh wait, this person can be a really great leader because they lead under a extreme pressured environment, right? So is that something you felt where it's like, hey, heading up revenue recognition, working on commissions and all this, moving into a controllership role where I'm leading a team on general accounting and reporting and everything, really made it almost second nature to then walk in with your, sales operations team and lead them as well?
There's a couple of points that I think you touched on that I think are important, and I want to drive a little further on.
Yeah.
The CFO's role in the past 20 years or so, I think has changed dramatically. I think it is grown from being where do we invest? How do we invest in the company and grow our product and grow our base? And how do I fund those things? Further to having those operational elements. And I think as the CFO's role has become more of a operations officer role as well. And they start to think about, well, if I'm investing in this, how are we achieving operational excellence and how does this stuff move and flow? I think as that role has grown and changed, I think that's then what ends up driving some of the change in the controllership role.
Yep.
Because naturally they're going to want to hand off some of that responsibility, or they'll need somebody to support and drive their additional responsibilities, right?
Yeah, you have to delegate, right? There's no way to do all of that work. And so you got to trust your right and left hand, which is either your controller or your FP&A team, right?
That's right. And so I think there's probably bits of that are falling to both sides, but I think more of it's falling to the controllership, because the FP&A side really is more about how do I advise the business, not how are their processes working. Whereas the controllership side needs to understand how the processes are working, because all of that data then flows into my financials.
Yeah.
And I need to make sure that those processes are clean, efficient, so that my team who's at the end of it isn't getting crushed, and that our financials are accurate. And so I see more of that. I see part of that being the reason for the transition in the controllership role. But then additionally, like you said, some of these major accounting changes then also force the controller to be more involved in this stuff. And so I think the combination of those two things then drive a lot more operational impact into the controller. Now, for me personally, yes, absolutely. I think coming from a background where I understood or I had exposure to more of the operational stuff, has let me step into my sales operations team and say, got it. I understand the pressures that you're under. Here's how we need to group and move things. And here's how we need to support both sides of the house. And by the way, because you are such a critical partner to the accounting side of things. You can't just look at, I've done all the things I need to do and then throw something over the fence, because you're now just crushing somebody on the other side. So as we look to optimize the process all the way through, you need to think about not just what information you're getting, what you're doing, but where that information is going. And that's a big thing that I'm pushing everybody on, which is making sure they understand all the critical touch points beyond just themselves. Like that can be your core competency. That's fine. You can be the accountant, but to be more than that in today's world, you really need to understand how everything's flowing and fitting together, where your risk points are, how you address them, and how you make sure that, everybody who's working at your company is trying to do the best they can. So how do you support them? How do you make sure that everything's good, so that the work is being distributed equally and nobody's getting crushed because, hey, I finished my part. Here you go.
No longer my problem, right? Like,
no longer my problem.
Moving from that solely that individual contributor mindset to, understanding your value and your position in the greater organization, right? And a lot of, and this is true for myself, right? Like the learning came from me first before I could even apply it to my team, which is, having that perspective of what someone does and what you do. So it's like, what am I doing? Where do I fit in this larger puzzle? And then having other people understand that. And it's what I see the two biggest issues, if you were to break it down, like distill it to its most pure form within organizations, are an issue of perspective and an issue of communication, right? Like those are the two biggest things that hold companies back. Now they manifest in much more tangible ways, but perspective is just talking about like, hey, what am I doing and how is it passing off to accounting, or what in accounting am I doing that is passing off to sales or operations or anything else, and not just stuck in your own world, understanding how you're affecting that other person, and then effectively communicating what that means, right? Like where you feel you sit, where you think you're helping or hurting them. And that's where I think, this rise of the operational controller and the operational accounting function is really trying to address those two issues. And, like FloQast, we understand that. So we try to build our software around that. But there's a larger philosophy and mindset and market that you're speaking to that needs to take place. It's like whether you put the software in or not, you have to believe that this change needs to happen, right? And it sounds like that's what you're trying to provide your team.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that is important as we move through this transition, and you mentioned it earlier, and so I just wanted to circle back on it, was the concept that accounting is back office. And I think if organizations believe that accounting is back office, you have additional problems. Accounting does do a lot of the back office processing stuff, but if you don't look at them as a strategic partner, if you're not including them in decisions up front on go-to-market strategies, business direction, all sorts of stuff, you cause a lot of thrash within the organization. Because now accounting is trying to react to support the business. And sometimes the decisions are made with the best intentions of the business, but violate some rule of accounting or some issue. And now these hoops need to be jumped through. And so a good controller, in my mind, partners with the business to understand their needs and then be in the conversations as they're happening. So that pricing gets structured correctly, go-to-market strategies get structured in a way that is successful for the business, but then also works within the accounting rules, right? So having that touching more departments gives the controller greater visibility to have those conversations with the leaders and be included in those conversations as they go on. I think that might have been the thing in the past 10 or 15 years where CFOs were in those conversations and driving some of the more detailed accounting conversations. And as they've taken on additional responsibilities, some of that stuff might get lost in translation or not come to the forefront of their mind as they're making these decisions at the leadership level. And so that's why I think it's really important that accounting is looked at not as a back office operation, but as a strategic partner to ensure the success of the business. Because at the end of the day, your financials are what you're going to get measured by, right? FP&A is great. They're looking for, they're hyping people up on the future of the business and how things are trending and why that's amazing. But then when you look backwards, that the accounting is the proof in the pudding that your FP&A function is not being overly optimistic or overly pessimistic, because people will look back at the trend and say, well, look, your revenues really are growing by 200% quarter over quarter.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's, that to me, I think there's a lot to be said with the difference between the CFO and the controller and the rest of the accounting function, right? Because your CFO is an executive, so they're really setting tone and strategy. But when it comes to execution, that's really where your senior leadership with your controller and your really more tactical folks with your accounting staff, your specialists and everything, those are the guys that really execute it. So there's oftentimes, I think you see a lot of organizations try to set strategy, but the ones that are successful are the ones that have the senior leadership or the senior management that is able to change that strategy into an execution, right? Yep. And that's where this shift in the controller from just being a controller to this operational leader is so very important, right? Because that's the execution of it. And I think organizations are finally starting to see that. And I think, outside of tech, when you look at CPG, like this is barely in my experience, this is barely kind of starting to take hold in CPG, where the controller is shifting to this operational role and helping in that. And I think it tends to be in smaller CPGs that are in growth phases or startups that they're leveraging that because they're seeing it in tech, or it just kind of naturally happened. But yeah, it's like, that 10 to 15 years of the CFO doing that has made some changes, but I think the rapid growth has really come from the execution at the controller level.
And that's an excellent point. And one of the other things that I think is a key point is extremely large organizations probably haven't gone through this transformation yet.
Right.
There may be another layer or another executive leader that takes on more of the operational excellence. I to your point, I really see this as kind of a small to mid-size thing that happens for controllers. Yeah. At 1,000+ companies, they usually have a chief operations officer with their whole own org that focuses on this stuff. But at the same time, in those organizations where you have a VP controller, they need to partner tightly with that COO's right hand, because all of that stuff then is still going to be driven into the financial systems. And so that relationship needs to be extremely tight, and those two people need to be walking in tandem.
Yeah. And when you talk about that relationship, going back to my own experience, you talk a lot about understanding the perspective of what they need in that part of the organization. But, in my experience, I'd be curious to hear yours. It's not that when I come in and I try to be an operational leader, or I try to work cross-function, whether it's operations or sales, that, I'm like, well, this is the way we're doing it. Oftentimes, what I do is I honestly, it's almost like the Socratic method, right? You just go in there and you ask them a bunch of questions all the time that they maybe didn't even think about, because you have different perspectives. So, you're like, well, why don't you just do this? And then there's like this awkward silence. And then they're like, and I think good operational leaders and good operational, staff won't, be offended by this, but they'll say, oh, yeah, I got to think about that. Right. And then they're like, oh yeah, actually, we should, maybe think about this and change our way. So it's not like, oftentimes I feel like I have to go in there and tell them what to do. I just say, well, hey, this number really doesn't match to like my understanding of the numbers or the way you're seeing it. Why is that? And, a good operational leader again will be like, oh, that's curious. Let me go back in, and they'll be like, oh, I was looking at maybe the wrong number, or Stefan, you are looking at the wrong number. You need to understand X, Y, and Z. And you leave this meeting with this greater understanding, and you work closely together. And it's not always, that leadership isn't always necessarily leading in this classic sense of like owning and taking charge. It is partnering, right? So curious if that's been like kind of your, your path and your understanding, or maybe it's different in tech.
No, actually, my approach when working with people is exactly the same, right? Everybody set up their processes to work for them. And I'm coming into it with an opinion and a viewpoint, but I'm not coming in with judgment. And so I want to hear and understand, why is it that you're doing this? So I'm like you, I come in and I say, so why? Help me understand. Why do you do it this way? I've seen it done this other way before. maybe your way's better and I can learn something from that, and we can build on that. Or maybe I have some insight that I can bring to you that will help make your life and your team better. And so it's really about conversations. And I agree with you. True leadership is not the I don't know, old school, I'm the boss, this is how we're going to do it, right? What is the saying? If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go with a group.
I don't know if I've heard that, but I really like that. That's good.
Yes. So I really like that saying, because I think as you come into organizations, either taking a new department over or starting a new position entirely, that it's really about going far together. And how do we do that together? And if you come in with, I know best, people stop listening and you're not going to get anything done. And so you might have the best idea in the room, but if you position it wrong, or you come in with an attitude, or you come in with judgment or an agenda, I think it gets lost. And I think people, shut down and stop hearing you. And so the best organizations that I've been a part of are ones that people listen and they're open to ideas, and they're open to have the conversation, right? Like we're all humans. And everybody sometimes is so afraid of getting called out for a mistake or whatever else. But that's really the only way that you can grow and change, right? If we're always kind of hiding, then you can't get better. And I think in my career, where I've made mistakes and that's been uncomfortable for me, is where I've had the greatest amount of growing. Yes. And it's something that I don't think we address enough, as a culture. Now, again, you can't make the same mistake over and over, and you can't, blah, blah, blah. But making an honest mistake with the best intentions, I'm 100% forgiving about that. I don't care. I appreciate that you tried, and that you own your mistake. Yeah. And then you can change the process, right? You can make the operations better. You can make things more accurate. You can solve the problem. But if you don't admit that there's a problem, you can never solve it.
Yeah, you'll never, it's only going to fester and get worse. And, it's kind of goes to that saying where it's like, the weakest link, right, is the strength of the chain. So, if I'm a firm believer that you don't have growth without friction, right? If you think about like exercise, right? Like you don't get muscle gains without putting friction on your muscles, right? And you're not going to have, professional gains without having friction in your career and addressing it. And, you're not looking to create friction necessarily, but you need to meet that challenge head on, right? You can't avoid it. And that's where I think sometimes accounting does so well working in the broader organization is, the close is such an iterative process, reporting such an iterative process that we really go through this like grind all the time to get things done. And we hit these different unique challenges that business put on us, whether it's your business specifically, the broader business environment, regulatory environment, there's all these different pressures going on. And we go through this high pressure. And so when we go into the greater organization, we just have that, we have that competence built into us, and we can then help other teams operationalize and kind of get our same experience and exposure and become better, right? Like that's where I think I saw, kind of like something that really made me enjoy work and have happiness from work was when you work with your sales ops team and you said, hey, I think, we're having this issue, want to get your thoughts, XYZ. Okay, we're all in agreement. Maybe you guys could make this change and see how it goes. And then you kind of talk to them maybe 3-4 months later, and they're like, hey, I feel like I'm doing my job so much better because of what you said. And I'm able to execute so much better because you really operationalized whatever it was. You put a process, you had adherence to it, and they're happier. And that's kind of that growth and friction that you're talking about that I think is so great.
Yeah. And to your point, friction is not a bad thing. It's how you approach it and handle it with folks. Making sure that the friction doesn't develop into frustration or discontent with your partners is important. So coming from, I think, a place of help me understand, and maybe I have an idea that will work better for everybody. That's not incrementally harder for you, right? That's the other thing. Right. You're going to come and have a conversation where you're going to blow up somebody's process, and it's going to make it a ton harder for them. That's something else that somebody's going to be resistant to as well. But if you share the pain if you need to, or there's other ways to approach it, I think that's important as well.
Yeah. And, what you're kind of making me think of is this concept that we talk a lot about. I'm not even going to say FloQast talks about internally, because we do, but I think the larger industry has talked about this for a long time. You'll see it in Accounting Today and all the different Journal of Accountancy, all your different publications, is this shift that accountants need to make from just their classic role of CPA or accounting staff or CFO into advisor, right?
Yes.
So that leadership you need to bring to the broader organization to become an operational leader for them. The path you should really take is starting as trying to become an advisor to them by asking the questions, by building that trust, by iterating that trust with them. And then you're a trusted advisor to them. So they'll seek you out when they have new changes or they want to do something new. They'll say, hey, Dante, we're thinking about running our contracts like this. What do you think? We think it's going to drive a lot of sales or whatever, or it's going to make this process. And you don't have to find that out later under this like painful circumstances. Like you said, they're not just tossing that bag over the fence and crushing you. They are telling you like, hey, we kind of want to increase flow here. Can you guys handle it? What do you think? And you can get ahead of that, which is so powerful. That's that perspective and that communication piece that if you remove that clog in the filter and the drain, all of a sudden, now you're really seeing in the organization as whole this operational excellence that we all want to achieve, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, I think when organizations are I think there's two areas where operations starts to fall by the wayside. If a company's growing and they're very growth focused, operational excellence can sometimes become an afterthought.
Yep.
And I get it. It's hard to handle increased volumes of work, but then also think about how do I fix these processes to make them run smoother? But if you don't, then it's just going to continue to be hard.
Yep.
And the other time is, and it's one of the things I've talked about with my team a whole bunch. One of the things I don't like hearing is, well, we've always done it that way.
Yes.
Cool. That's great. And I get that that's worked, but maybe we should look at trying to do something a little different, because maybe that'll make life better for you, for the person behind you, for the person in front of you. So let's just have that conversation, right? And if your whole thing is, well, we've always done it that way and I don't know why, then I have more questions.
Yep.
Why don't you know why? Let's dig into it. Let's figure out other pieces. So
yeah, that's moving from the people aspect that we've been talking about into that culture aspect, right? That other, it's like kind of like people, culture, and technology.
Yeah. And
that culture side, that can be a tough thing to manage and make sure that you have a culture that is embracing that conversation and change.
Yep. And to your point, I think that's part of an advisor's role, is to come in and ask those questions of the culture of those leaders and even of those individuals, and say, well, why are we doing this? And I have a thought. Maybe my thought's great. Maybe it's horrible, but you help me understand why it is or isn't, and help me understand how that impacts you and your life and your world. And then I can advise as to, maybe how we get to a better state. How do we get to a better thing? And then that operational excellence, that focus on that, allows things to move faster, cleaner, smoother, less friction, more accurate reporting, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. And I think it's, it goes back to like where you get that friction in the organization. Hopefully, if you've been an advisor for someone that is willing to embrace change, it'll show people that you can help them become a better value add to the organization.
Yep.
And you can show them, you will drive some happiness in your life if you feel like you are actually contributing in some way to the success of the organization, whether that's directly to the bottom line or just maybe it's to the lives of your coworkers, that they don't have to work as much because you did something better, right? As humans, I think we will naturally derive a lot of value or like happiness from that if we do it. And that's where that culture piece, like that one can be hard to like change over time. But if you find, sometimes you find the right company that's willing to embrace that. I know I got lucky with Kodiak Cakes being, a culture that embraced that, Skull Candy being a culture that embraced that. But I talked to a lot of peers out there and a lot of colleagues, and they don't land in those positions. And it's like, that's a tough thing to manage. This culture piece kind of gets into, what effects, I kind of wanted to talk about this because I think this is top of mind for a lot of people. What effects have COVID had in this shift for you? Did it manifest any other changes? Do you feel like it accelerated things? Maybe it put the brake on things when we talk about this shift to this operational side of accounting?
Yeah, it's interesting. In some aspects, I think it has forced, at least, so I'll speak from the aspect of software companies. That's where I'm most at home. Actian is a software company. I think for us, it didn't impact our operations too much. Most of what we do was easily done from home. Mm-hmm. What I did think it highlighted were the things that we were doing in the office that didn't make sense.
Yep.
Maybe meetings that we had that didn't need to be had. Conversations that were happening that didn't really amount to anything. And so I think it's really kind of narrowed the scope and focused on what are the things that actually need to happen. Right now, when you get on a call with somebody, at least for me, I feel like I have much more targeted conversations. I'm trying to solve and achieve a particular thing versus some of these other conversations that were happening in the office or these other meetings that were happening in the office. And then I also think that it's helped me to get maybe the right core group of folks together instead of thinking that it might possibly impact somebody else and pulling in too many people, right? So so that I think has helped me and helped us kind of focus on particular things. Now, some of the stuff that I think has made it a little more challenging is some of the processes that the individual is doing have become harder to see.
Yes.
If you're not sitting next to somebody asking questions that just come up because you're sitting next to them, or you see something or you hear something, it becomes harder to narrow in on where they have friction points sometimes.
Yep.
Than if you're in the office and you can address those things naturally. So it's forced me to have more conversations with individuals about, how are you doing? Tell me about the process that you're working on. Tell me about your friction points. Tell me about those things. And that sometimes is a little bit more time consuming than it had been previously for me.
Yeah.
So that's some of the other side of the change that's happened for me from a work perspective. Now I'll say again, and I made this comment earlier, not going into the office, just if I focus on the personal aspects of how COVID has impacted my life, not having to spend an hour, 45 minutes in the car, driving to the office and driving home has been fantastic. And it's been great for me because I have a 2.5-year-old that I would not have seen grow the way that I have through COVID. And so I'm hoping that companies continue to embrace either a hybrid or remote work situation. I'm a big fan. It works for me. It works for my organizations that I lead. And I understand that might not work for all organizations and all departments, but from what I've seen, we are still running efficiently and meeting our deadlines and doing so with excellence. Yeah,
that's a lot of what I saw too, right? I think taking it back to the beginning is the team. I was kind of worried, not just for the team, actually for myself. I was like, man, can I be efficient at home? I got distractions all over the place at home. And, I think you struggle for maybe a little bit, right, with those distractions, but eventually you get into a routine where you're like, no, like I'm in my office, I'm working, or I'm at, at my kitchen table working, whatever it is. But the team was actually really highly successful in transitioning to this work from home model almost overnight, which I think goes back to a lot of the DNA of accountants, whether that's, a controller or a staff or a specialist or a CFO. There's just this dedication in their DNA to get the work done. And I also think there's just enough work to get done. You really can't not focus. It did highlight, I love what you talk about. It's like it highlighted some different inefficiencies in the process that you didn't necessarily see or understand, whether that was like meeting attendance and how many people you pulled in, whether that was, how things, how certain things transitioned between people was not communicated well or was inefficient. But it made it hard to understand workload capacity of your team and what they're working on if they're struggling with something. A lot of times when you're in the office, you can see that's like, man, maybe I don't talk to this person a lot, but I see them just grinding at their desk. Like, what's going on, right? Because they don't report to you. Maybe they're 2 below you or 1 below you or in a different department. And you can, if they're there and you see it, you can engage in them and fix that. But if you don't, sometimes they get lost kind of in that virtual reality, right? Where they're just, this virtual world, they're not seeing it. You can't help them. So it's kind of interesting how it's highlighted some issues and helped us address those. But these other ones, we can't lose track of those, even though we're not seeing them. But I would agree. I think, for me, I think that virtual hybrid model is really can be very impactful to a lot of organizations. But each organization has their own unique circumstances, right? Like some maybe have different circumstances that require them to be in person. Others are lucky. Like I feel like in my situation where the team really didn't need to come back in, we had a culture that was successful around that. The organization supported it. But then also having the option for people to go back in if that's the structure that they need. So it's kind of an interesting world out there, but I think you really hit well on, it's just highlighting different challenges within the organization, which is a good thing. It's good to feel that pain, because we go back to that point you made about friction, and you need to embrace those hard things. And if you don't have it, you don't know about it. You might be sleeping on it. I kind of want to take that into understanding like where you think this role is going in the future, whether that's, the role of the controller, the corporate controller, or even the profession in general when we talk about this operational side of the house.
Yeah, so I think as the CFO role continues to evolve to be kind of in a lot of companies, an operations role, an operations officer as well, that's going to continue the drive for the corporate controller to pick up more operational impact aspects of the company and have impact. And then on top of that, when people start to move around between companies and they said, hey, at my last company, I had input or influence over this department, and this is how it made us more successful. This is how I changed the lives of those folks, and this is how I was better able to support the C-suite. I think you'll see more companies start to adopt having controllers take on more operational aspects at certain sizes. So I see as the CFO's role continues to broaden and take on these additional responsibilities, I see the corporate controller naturally picking up some of this stuff as well. And so in 10 years from now, it wouldn't surprise me if corporate controllers had a lot more operational type departments reporting into them for the same reasons that we've talked about today. People are moving. It touches my financial system, so I need to have influence on it. And then I think those things will help those corporate controllers that then move to the next level, right? CFO or VP finance or whatever, have better sensitivity to, what the other departments have gone through, how to support them better. If I know what your pain points are coming into a peer type position, I can better support you because I've been through it. I understand it. I can help address it or sympathize with you, and we can figure it out together. Yeah. And I think that's where you'll continue to see those operational pieces fall within the controllership. There's some I think natural limitations to how far out you go from the controllership to have them kind of directly oversee things.
I was going to ask you that. Where do you think the breakdown is, or where do you think the line is going to kind of manifest in the sand, so to speak, on how much the accounting function should step into operations?
Yeah. So I in my mind, it's anything that hooks into the financial system, it's like the first touch. So your Salesforce that comes into your SAPs or NetSuites or whatever, your procurement systems that touch your financial reporting systems, your commission systems that touch that stuff, et cetera. Like, I think those are natural kind of evolutions for the corporate controller to either oversee directly or have a lot of influence on, because all of that stuff ultimately feeds into their system, and they need to own those results and ultimately make sure that those processes and operations are working efficiently and capturing all the right data, right?
So do you kind of say, like with Salesforce, sorry to cut you off, but I want to get into that more, is, so Salesforce, obviously a very large platform. So when we talk about your role in assisting that, are you saying that once it manifests into what could be either a transaction or financial data, right? Because sometimes it's not always the same, right? Sometimes a transaction, sometimes it feeds into reporting. Is that kind of the cutoff point within the system? You think that, the controller needs to have, at the very least, a large amount of input on?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. I think when it's a transaction within Salesforce, the controller absolutely needs to have a large amount of influence on. When you talk about financial data, there's varying degrees as to, I think, where the corporate controller gets involved. In my mind, it's when if you take order management, for example, they're taking the order, they've looked at all the data in there, and they're ready to process it, move it to your financial system. Corporate controller heavily involved there. If it's the sales rep or some other group before that point entering information into Salesforce, I think there's a conversation to be had where the corporate controller says, hey, here's the process by which that happens, but they don't necessarily oversee it or have that direct influence, right? I need you to fill out the data in a certain way. Then the teams that you would oversee that actually check and review that before it touches your financial system is where the controller would have then either very large voice or maybe direct oversight of.
Yep. That's such a unique perspective, because you and I obviously talk offline before we even have this interview, which I regret not recording the first one because it was such a great conversation. But I had never really looked at it from the sense of, if I look at it from a systems approach, you can draw some pretty clean lines in the sand using whether it's transaction. You get in some gray area, like you said, when it comes to financial data, reporting data. But at least it gives you a pretty good area of like, okay, well, stepping beyond this might be inappropriate, because we're not necessarily trying to take over the world. We're just trying to help the organization, and we only want to do that as it's appropriate. So I really like that perspective, because I've always broken it down more from, I've looked at it maybe too people oriented or process oriented, not considered that tech side of it, where it's like, okay, well, once they're starting working on a transaction, I need to kind of make sure I understand it. I know what's going on here, but sometimes I may be swimming out of my lanes in that mindset. And so taking a more holistic view and also taking in that technology side and saying, but the tech kind of makes a clean line here. Maybe this is a good place to have my mindset of like, okay, once I get here, I really need to think carefully about how much more I try to exert myself, or what kind of influence I'm placing on the organization. Not only because, what that means to the organization, but it's like, you might be putting too much burden on yourself, right? And you might not be the expert anymore in what you're trying to lead, and you're kind of stepping more outside of your role, in which case that's not a bad thing. It just means, well, that's maybe not a controller role. And if you really want to do that, you might need to take a true operations position in the organization. So I really like that viewpoint. And I don't want to keep you too long, so I'll kind of ask this last question. But as you see this growing responsibility on your plate, and this growing responsibility of the controllership in general and the function in general, how are you then delegating and shifting that work down?
Yeah, so for me, I've created specific swim lanes, if you will. Mm-hmm. So the opportunity that I have for my assistant controller, and she's amazing, is to basically have her house and oversee all of the accounting, right? All of the day-to-day accounting management, from revenue, to cash to AP, all that stuff. That's her swim lane. I have a really good or really great sales operations manager. I've just hired a commissions manager. I think he's going to be awesome. He's a really easy guy to work with. And then I have my payroll manager. And so I have my very distinct lanes that when I'm talking to, so-and-so, I know what that means to me. I know what my issues and my priorities are that I need to focus on. Yeah. And and if I can just segue a little bit, what I've really enjoyed about this is the opportunity to interact with leaders in a different way that I wouldn't have. So a couple of weeks ago, I got to sit in a leadership meeting with our CEO, our CMO, our CRO, all the CO titles.
Yep, all the C-suite, yeah.
Yeah, all the C-suite. And it was really great hearing about, hey, we have this new product. It's called Avalanche, for a small plug. Please go look it up.
Of course.
What's our go-to-market strategy on that? How do we support the SaaS product that we're putting out there? how do we make it meaningful for our customers? How do we price it? How do we do all of those things? And a corporate controller sometimes gets to see those things. But having a voice and saying, look, from a pricing metric, from a revenue recognition metric, from how the information is flowing through our system, how we're reporting back out to see if we're successful here. Yeah. Having the swim lanes and the reporting that I have right now has allowed me to do that, right? How do we motivate our sales reps to sell this product in a way that excites them, but doesn't destroy the margin?
Yeah. And I think that kind of goes back to that point of, that C-suite that is setting strategy and tone don't always have a good lens on execution. And you can really be that bridge for the C-suite to that execution in your role. And, that's an immense responsibility, but it also shows your value add to the overall organization. You can really see how you're impacting literal financial statement line items, right? And how you're affecting your teams and all that kind of stuff. And it's a really great place to be. And I couldn't agree more. I think you're going to see more and more with that, either your senior accounting managers, and your assistant controllers taking on more of that close responsibility, that reporting responsibility, because it has to be pushed down and they're the natural person to push it to, which means they got to elevate their team, right? Like you got to get even your staff outside of the mundane that you were talking about very early in our conversation, where they're maybe too stuck in these little transactions, shackled by the mundane tactical work they're doing. And you need to get them to be more strategic, value add people to the organization as well. So I couldn't agree with more. Like that's the trend that you're going to see in the future with the organization. And you touched on, if you embrace this philosophy, you can really see some cool stuff as a controller that a controller 10 years ago wouldn't have, right?
Absolutely.
And you are going to have more satisfaction from the work you do, which is really what I think all of us want. At the end of the day, whether you're aiming to be the CFO, the CEO, the COO, or just the controller, by putting more value into that position, you just create a much better work-life dynamic. So I think that's wonderful.
And just one final thought, and I think it's eloquent that you brought it up. The CFO role has changed. The controller role has changed. Everyone down the org is going to change. The assistant controller is not going to be doing the same thing they were 5 or 10 years ago. The accounting manager isn't going to be doing the same thing they were doing 5 or 10 years ago. A new staff or associate coming on. Again, the more that people earlier in their career can think about, how do I become an advisor, whether that's to my manager or to my business partners, I think will help them embrace the change that is already underway and occurring.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, I really think it's so important to just recognize that. And when I think back to the beginning of our conversation, your story, you're, in my opinion, you're really a leader in this mindset by when you kind of realize moving from your internal audit function into general accounting and moving to controller, you've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. A lot of people have not, they've not made this connection. So with that, I'll kind of cap and just say, like, Dante, thank you for being an industry leader. Thank you for helping us have this conversation. I think this is some really great stuff that a lot of people want to talk about, and we don't always get an outlet. So I really appreciate you sharing your story and your perspective. I think it was very unique and very helpful to me. I'm no longer a controller. But I wish I kind of had this content 5 years ago when I started into this route, because I think it would have changed a lot of my path. So I'm hoping that anybody that's listening is able to kind of glean a lot from what you said. Thank you so much, Dante. Again, with Actian, sounds like you got a new product, Avalanche, coming out. But with that, thank you for joining us on this episode of Blood, Sweat, and Balance Sheets. Please reach out to us at FloQast. If there's anything, that you want to dive deeper into, or give us suggestions at info@flowcast.com. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.